In this class we will look at global business and the whole phenomenon of globalization. However, before we start looking at the implications and what it means, it's worth remembering that global business has been around probably for many centuries. In fact, we've traded for the last millennia across national boundaries. But in the last probably 20 years or 30 years, the phenomenon has really taken off. And in particular, in the last decades of the 20th century, many barriers to international trade fell, and firms began pursuing global strategies rather than national strategies. The idea was to gain competitive advantage. So we get more and more interlocking of firms across national boundaries in terms of production, logistics, marketing, and so on. So companies are becoming much more global. So rather than thinking in national markets or in terms of national economies, business leaders have started to think in terms of global markets. Now we need to have a look at to see why this has happened. Why in particular recently has it happened? Why didn't it happen 100 years ago or whatever? So we need to look at the causes of this. And specifically we'll look at the very rapid expansion of trade over probably the last 10, 20, 30 years. And the first thing we can identify is that there's been a rising real improvement in living standards across many countries. This means that it's easy to export and to deal with those countries. The customers there have the resources, have the income to buy the output, and there are vibrant markets in those economies. So that's the first cause, rising real living standards. Secondly, there has been a push on the part of governments and international organisations to try and liberalise trade, make it easy to trade across boundaries, to reduce tariff barriers and obstacles. And those have been quite effective. So the World Trade Organization, for example, the European Union and many others have tried to reduce the barriers. And there's also been a movement towards market systems throughout the world, so that business is easier to be conducted. It's easier done. It's easier to get markets and to sell and to buy and to trade in those economies. This is particularly true, of course, of Eastern Europe, where the communist bloc has fragmented and have now become market economies. But it's also happened in China and right throughout the world. So it's easier to trade. There's also been a rapid growth in some economies. These are sometimes known as the Asian tigers. For example, China and India. Both of those countries are growing very rapidly given their size, and they are creating enormous markets in which to trade. There have also been privatisation and liberalisation in domestic markets. Some governments have really embraced the market system and have gone towards winding back the state, privatising the state, and this in itself has created opportunities for companies to trade across national boundaries. Perhaps markets which in the past were protected are no longer protected, and now the markets are open for trading purposes. There's also been a deregulation of international capital markets. It's easy now to move capital from one country to another. It's not entirely free. Some countries still hang on to some practices. So, for example, it may be easy to invest in India, for example, but it might be more difficult to repatriate profits or to take the capital back out of the country. That's just one example, but there are many situations in many countries which, although the markets have been deregulated, it can be a bit tricky or a bit difficult to to consider them fully open. They're not fully open, they are partially open. Perhaps in the future they will open completely. Transport has become cheaper as well, which has caused an expansion of trade. Bigger and more efficient ships, the use of containers, and ports have been improved, and the technology within ports, logistical systems. Countries have built roads to serve the ports. It's easier. So transport has become cheaper to move goods around, and that has also encouraged trade. And of course there's been a massive improvement in global communications, not just the internet, but the telephone system, all sorts of communications facilities which did not exist, or existed but were not fully functional, not fully usable in the past. It was difficult, and also the communication systems were not very reliable. So with all of these factors, international trade has expanded greatly over the last 10-20 years. So what is globalization? Well, it's a business philosophy based on the belief that the world is becoming more similar. National distinctions are fading and will eventually disappear. We can see this to some extent in advertisements on television. The same advertisement may be run in different countries. The language has changed, but it's essentially the same advertisement. So there are economies in advertising. There are economies in marketing in general. There are similarities that are, because of the communication systems, and because we can now view programs from different countries, and we understand the culture of countries more fully, it's much more easy to trade with those people, and for peoples to trade right throughout the world. So one set of people can trade with another set of people on a very easy basis, because there's greater understanding between them in terms of their wants, their needs, given their location, and so on. So that's one point. There's an increased contact, of course, and awareness and interdependency in economic activity and social relations. That's also probably a function of the communication system. We now know what's going on in countries, and what the government's doing, and what the people are doing, and the type of goods they're making, and the way they're living, and there's much more information around, so that there's less fear in trading. We understand each other a lot better. Because the world is becoming more similar, then the companies tend to think globally and to standardize their strategy across national boundaries. So many companies do not see themselves as national anymore. They consider themselves perhaps initially serving the national market, but with one eye on exports and trading in other countries. So globalization is the logical outcome of all of that. So what does it concern? Well, globalization concerns the trade in goods and services. Well, that's obvious. It obviously concerns that. It concerns investment. Where does the investment take place? The amount of the investment, the extent to which the markets are interconnected. It deals with labour force movements. Is the labour force trained, and has it got the ability to move and to be mobile and to be flexible and to adjust according to international demand? The products themselves are becoming more standard, but at the same time more of the product is required, and it's the ability to produce in different centres, perhaps in different production centres throughout the world. or perhaps to move partly completed goods from one country to another, so that there are greater economies in production. Perhaps a good is partly made in one country, then shipped to another country where it's finished, and then re-exported to a third country. The idea is to save on production costs. So that's really, that covers the products and the production, are really can be seen together there. The technology is also the case that the technology can be shared, and also the technology enables globalization to happen. It's easier because computer systems and databases and information flows are more easily facilitated when there is a globalized situation with good communication systems, as opposed to what happened in the past, when everything was a mystery, or information was sent by paper. It took time, it had to be interpreted. Perhaps it took business meetings, face-to-face meetings. There was misunderstandings of what was required and what was done, and it was not as easy as it is by today's standards. Of course, research and development is a big saving. If research and development takes place in one country and there is a breakthrough, some piece of innovation, then that can be shared throughout the different plants and the different trading partners in other countries. So we're all not inventing the wheel at the same time. One group invents the wheel and everybody else gets to use it. So there are enormous economies in terms of research and development. And the exchange of ideas. We've also got academics and universities connecting together. Students are starting to have a common view of the outcome of education and the need to service the economy and to have a prosperous economy. There's greater understanding of the types of trade that's required to bring this about, greater understanding of people, more tolerance towards differences. And there's more information flowing around the system. There's also an issue of intellectual property. Of course, this idea of stealing ideas is not acceptable. Intellectual property is the ownership of the people who did the thing in the first place, who developed the product or who came up with the idea, and that has to be protected. And that's probably most easily protected when there are strong connections between the companies into different national areas, so that if an idea is stolen in a country, then the representative of the company in that country can make representation to the government and to the police authorities to have it stopped, have copying and counterfeiting defeated. So that's the intellectual property. Well, what are the key features of globalization? Well, obviously the key feature is there has been a very rapid expansion in international trade. We've already talked about that. There's an internationalization of products and services. It's possible to buy a soap powder in one country and buy the same soap powder in a different country. So there's a standardization. And images are understood more throughout the world. For example, the Coca-Cola image or the Pepsi-Cola image. It's understood throughout the world. It's a Pepsi-Cola or it's a Coca-Cola. There's increasing importance of multinational corporations. We're starting to see these organizations as being extremely powerful. It's also very difficult to control them because we don't know where the center is. So if a company is operating in many countries, it's sometimes difficult to know where exactly that company is based. So there may be an issue in controlling the company because of that. We obviously see large transfers of capital, of money across national boundaries as companies pay off their debts in one country and buy items from another country. So the international markets, the foreign exchange market, has become a very important market in fostering all of this development. Globalization of technology, well, when an idea is developed, when a machine is developed or a technique is developed, the chances are it's going to be adopted more quickly in other countries, because it will be known there are better communication systems and people will know about the development and they themselves will work towards it. And also they'll see, in different countries, they'll see the different designs of products which are successful, and they will want to imitate those to be successful as well. So there's a globalization in technology. And we also see, of course, a shift of production from one country to another. Companies move to where it's cheapest to produce. If labour costs are cheap in one country and the product is labour intensive, we would expect to see that company move to that country. If, of course, the product is capital intensive, there are few workers, that incentive may not exist. But generally speaking, we see companies moving from one centre, from one country to another. This, of course, creates unemployment in one place and employment in the other place. In the host country benefits, they receive employment, but the country that's losing the company will experience unemployment. There's greater freedom and capacity for companies to trade when there's globalized markets, because it's easy for them to transfer resources. Banks, governments, agencies and so on facilitate it, make it happen, enable it to happen. Perhaps in the past it was difficult to transfer between one country and the next. So we can see that national markets are, in a sense, fusing together. They're coming together. The national markets are getting blurred. It's difficult to say that this is a British product or a Japanese product or an American product, because it may be produced in many countries. And if it's produced in many countries, well, where was the product made? Who owns the product? So national markets tending to fuse. And of course, with this, we see economic integration. We see countries coming together as well to form entities. The European Union is a good example, where many countries have come together and have given up some of their powers to a central bloc who look after the whole area, the whole region. That's just a logical extension of the fusing of national markets. And we also have global economic interdependence. If one country is in trouble, it may mean there are knock-ons into other countries. We see it within the European Union. When one country gets into trouble, it overspends, or it has a problem, a financial problem, a fiscal problem, it involves all of the region. All of the other countries are affected. So it does impose pressure on the governments to behave responsibly in their spending and in their taxation policy. And also the international markets, the foreign exchange markets, are connected. And if one country is not playing according to the rules, not playing fairly, then it will affect everyone else. And there will be meetings and debates and disputes over the exchange rate or over some policy. But generally speaking, all of this is known and it's open. Everyone can see it, it's transparent. So those are some of the key features of globalization. Now, the multinational enterprise and the growth of the multinational enterprise. There are various forces that are driving the growth of the multinational corporation, the MNC, multinational corporation. For example, the search for growth markets. Companies, when they have exhausted the national market and they still want to grow further, they must look overseas. They must look to other countries. So they're constantly looking for growth markets to expand their own activities. As I said, there is a globalisation of markets, so it's logical that the multinational corporation will want to expand into other countries to exploit any opportunities that are there. They might also have a desire to reduce production costs, as I said earlier. If they can see a way of saving on production by moving part of the plant, or perhaps the whole plant, the whole factory, or the whole production unit to another country, they will do so. So they constantly move between different centres to reduce unit labour costs. They want to avoid transportation. If you make a product in one country and ship it to another country, you have to pay for the shipping. Perhaps it might be better to make it in the other country in the first place and save on the shipping. So avoiding transportation cost may be a factor that is in the mind of the multinational corporation. Also, of course, if you produce inside a country, you don't have to pay tariffs and you don't have the problems of clearing it through customs and getting it out and getting it onto the market. You've already produced it there. So for some countries, if it's difficult to trade with those countries, or if there are still some barriers to trade, the markets are not completely globalized, then companies might want to set up a plant in that country to avoid those problems. So actually make the product there and sell it there. Forward vertical integration means we're getting closer to the customer. Vertical integration means getting closer to the customer. Backward integration means we're getting closer to the raw materials and the sources of production. So vertical forward means going closer to the consumer, and the multinational corporations want to get as close to the consumer as possible to secure their markets. There's also, of course, extension of the product life cycle. When a company who's producing a product gets close to the end of its usefulness in one country, it might be that that particular product is a novelty somewhere else, and that consumers in other countries would love it. So one group of consumers are winding down and turning off the product. Perhaps in another country they're very excited about it. So it might extend the product life cycle. It might extend the usefulness of the product by going into another country. And of course, as I said earlier, the deregulation of capital markets also helped the multinational corporations to deal across boundaries. And that's it. Those are the factors that lead to globalization. There are many of them, but essentially it all bubbles down to cost savings and greater communication skills and greater understanding of the benefits of trading across national boundaries. Okay, that completes this class. Thank you for watching.